Okay, so everybody, welcome today to Echo. Kurt is somewhere in, I think, Utah or something, so where there is no service. And so today I'm so excited. We have Dr. Cole and then Dr. Olives from Hennepin Healthcare presenting, talking about precipitated withdrawal. Some of this is ER related, Dr. Cole. And I think Dr. Olives, I'm not quite sure, I don't know you as well, work in the emergency department there. For those of you who remember, Dr. Cole has presented a few times for us. Time number one was actually during COVID because he was at the very beginning of COVID as a physician who got quite ill. So it's so fun to remind people of, it just seems like that was eons ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. So all right, so coming up, you can see next week, we're talking about adolescence with Hazelton Betty Ford, Sarah Pauly. I'm just super excited. And actually, she's just transitioned out of that role at Hazelton Betty Ford. But she can talk to us about that next week. And then Sarah Spencer, our friend from Alaska, who's like literally on the cutting edge of everything, researchy things. Sarah comes back, and then a special exciting one, been interacting with Dr. Baker today, the medical examiner in Hennepin County. Xylazine is a huge thing, as we all know. It's just getting bigger. They keep talking about it at the summits. And actually, Sam Quinones sent an email today about xylazine and had a bunch of questions. So it's pretty exciting. I'm deferring all of his questions to Dr. Baker, though, because I don't know the answers. Dr. Cole probably does, having also works in poison control and all those things. So he's like, no, please don't send me your questions. If you all wouldn't mind, if you could turn your videos on if you're able, so Dr. Olive and Dr. Cole can definitely see your faces. It'd be great. There's still CME, and I saw the question come through. Katie can definitely help with that. Throughout the presentation, feel free to chat in questions. I can help facilitate those at the end, or you can unmute and ask away. For any assistance anyone needs, here's contact information. Erin, our nurse, is also, her email and cell phone are right there too. So never hesitate with any type of questions. I'm pretty sure we've either done it all or we'll send you to Charlie and he can answer them for you. Okay, we were really excited the manual is going to go live today. However, there's one more governmental layer of protection because why not? So it should be so soon. We did last revisions yesterday. We were so excited to say this morning that we could release it. It's going live today, but it'll be just, I would like to say a few short days, but again, it's a governmental layer. So who knows? But you can go to the course site. The manual will be there. All the recordings will be there for all the echoes and lots of information. So with that, I am taking down my slides. I will let you all share your slides and I will turn it over to you, Dr. Cole. I think you said you're starting. So if you want to give a little background, a little information, introduce yourselves, that'd be great. And again, thank you both so much for coming.
No problem. Thank you for having us. So my name is John Cole. I'm a emergency physician at Hennepin Healthcare and the medical director of the Minnesota Poison Control System. And I'm the site investigator for the ED Innovation Trial, which is a National Institutes on Drug Abuse randomized trial involving 17 hospitals around the country comparing a sub-Q 7-day induction of dose of buprenorphine for acute opioid withdrawal compared to a typical sublingual Suboxone initiation. So I have some personal experience with this, some research experience, and over the last 5 years, we've done a lot in terms of expanding our practice in the HCMC ED related to buprenorphine initiation for opioid use disorder. And as anyone might imagine, one of the first things that caregivers who start patients on this therapy worry about, and probably to some extent eventually encounter, is going to be buprenorphine precipitated opioid withdrawal, which is what we're going to talk about today. So these are objectives for the day. We're going to understand the pathophysiology of buprenorphine precipitated opioid withdrawal. We're going to develop an approach to treating it, at least to the best of our ability. And we're going to talk about a unique case involving a patient on kratom and how that patient population might also be an important one to pay attention to while we're considering who has opioid use disorder and what we start them on. So I think it's helpful to start just with a definition so that we're all sort of on the same page. But I got this definition from a review article in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. There's lots of resources for this, but buprenorphine precipitated opioid withdrawal is the abrupt displacement of opioid agonists binding at the opioid mu receptor by exposure to the partial agonist buprenorphine in a patient with opioid dependence and residual effects from a full agonist. So you have to have opioids on board and have dependence of some kind, and then have the buprenorphine work as a partial agonist, or in this case, functionally more like an antagonist. Sorry, oops, there we go. So it's worth spending just a little bit of time reviewing the pharmacology of buprenorphine so that we're all on the same page about this. So buprenorphine, remember, is a partial mu agonist with really high affinity for the receptor. So I am a simple person and I like simple words. So the way that I think about this, right, is it binds the receptor real tight, but only turns it on part way, which means it'll knock whatever else is there off. It has less respiratory depression than full mu agonist because of this. That's where the ceiling effect comes from. And it's long-term what we're shooting for with our patients. And fortunately, the ceiling effect for the respiratory depression applies mostly to just the respiratory depression and not the analgesic effect. But in general, that's a good thing long-term. It can be a real problem in the short term, though. It has that really high affinity we measure for the inhibitory constant. And the way to think about this for a drug at the receptor, when they report out a Ki, which is a number that I always find to be a challenging thing to intuit, the lower the Ki, the higher the affinity is. And so I put a chart over here on the right-hand side for people to look at. And as you can see, buprenorphine, which is right here, has a Ki of 0.22, which is in itself essentially meaningless, unless you happen to also know that oxycodone is 25, hydrocodone is 41, and methadone is 3. You'll notice too that fentanyl here is 1.3, which may or may not have something to do with how challenging it is to treat patients who have fentanyl use disorder, which is these days essentially everyone. This also illustrates really nicely to naloxone here, 0.62, which is why such small doses of naloxone on a milligram per milligram basis do so much to wake our patients up and in most cases save their lives. Although, as you'll see, it can also cause some clinical problems too. At therapeutic doses for buprenorphine, it essentially binds all your mu receptors. So regular doses of buprenorphine for opioid use disorder can precipitate withdrawal if patients are currently still dependent and have extant opioids around. And then I'm going to come back to this later. But the thing about buprenorphine to keep in the back of your mind, if you're a mechanisms person, is that while all opioids bind the mu receptor G protein, some of them activate another protein that's associated with the receptor called beta-arrestin, and some don't. And buprenorphine does not. And we'll come back to why that matters in a minute here. If you're a visual person, because I'm a visual learner, this is a simple way to think about buprenorphine precipitated withdrawal visually represented. So when you have no treatment initially, these are compared to the graphic I'm going to show, but these are your opioid receptors here, these little red upside down Pac-Man, and they're pale red, which means they're desensitized. So they don't respond as well to opioids at the agonist or partial agonist level. And then they use opioids. So you can, for all practical purposes, think of the gray upside down male symbols as fentanyl. And there's a low dose of, I get like one call in my office a month, and it's always when I lecture. I feel like someone's doing this to torture me. But the full mu agonist, as you can see here, binds that. And then because buprenorphine is so much more, has such a greater affinity, it'll bind this, knock it off. And as you can see over here, your opioid tone is high here. It decreases here, and that increases withdrawal. So the clinical effects, if you're a details person, I think one of the things that's really hard about this is when you have a patient in front of you who doesn't feel good and you give them buprenorphine and they start to feel worse. Is it the natural evolution of their withdrawal, or is it the buprenorphine that's making them worse? And this is something that people spend a lot of time in the research community on. In our trial, we have these mixed methods researchers who go over all the details of any possible precipitated withdrawal case, up to and including interviewing the patient if they can, to sort out, is this worsening withdrawal or is this precipitated withdrawal? And in some ways it might not matter, but if you really think it's the buprenorphine, the things to think about are, did the cows increase dramatically in a short period of time? That's really the way to sort of sort it out. And the cow should increase by 6 or more, and it should be within 10 to 15 minutes of the sublingual bupe. It should be a marked change, as opposed to you give the initial dose of buprenorphine, when you come back after 45 minutes or an hour and they're a little bit worse. It should be more of a, you give the initial dose and 10 minutes later, the nurse comes to get you to say, your patient looks like an absolute mess compared to before. What's going on here? It's generally not life-threatening, but there are some rare cases of people getting complications like Takotsubo cardiomyopathy because they dump all their catecholamines from the withdrawal and then get stress cardiomyopathy from that. So it's mostly okay, but it can still be dangerous for your patient. So we do have to watch out for this. So one of the things that's really hard to figure out is this actually common or is it actually uncommon? So this is early data from our trial. We were at the 1,200 patient mark. We are our goal is to enroll 2,000 patients, and we're about 1,500 right now. So we've got about 500 to go. And of the 1,200 patients, after all the adjudication's been done, we only have 9 cases of buprenorphine precipitated opioid withdrawal, or less than 1%. And this is in a trial where we enroll people down to a cows of 4. So it's a pretty high risk patient population. The other thing that's really interesting about this trial is because it's a NIDA-sponsored trial, there's a million different exclusion criteria. But interestingly enough, one of them is not when was your last use. So we'll enroll people who have used in the last hour even, as long as their cows is high enough to be in the trial. And even with that, we have less than 1% of cases of precipitated opioid withdrawal. However, when you look at big data from, in this case, this paper that was in the Journal of Addiction Medicine, 1,600 some patients from 49 US treatment centers who are using fentanyl and then transitioning on to either buprenorphine or methadone, I think you can see here, 22% of them report severe opioid withdrawal when they start their buprenorphine. That may or may not be true buprenorphine precipitated withdrawal. It's really, really hard to tell from this retrospective multi-center data poll. But I think what's helpful is to compare it to methadone, which of course is a full agonist and has absolutely no risk of precipitating opioid withdrawal. And still 11% of people report really severe opioid withdrawal while they're initiating this. So what this paper tells me is the prevalence of worsening withdrawal from the natural evolution of their disease is actually very, very high. And it's something that we all need to account for. Regardless, it's still worsening opioid withdrawal, whether we precipitate it or not. And fortunately, we can probably actually treat them both the same. If you really want a nice quick primer on this, this is in an emergency medicine journal, but it's relevant to anyone who practices addiction medicine of any kind. It's a nice short article. I can send you the PDF if you want. It's only like 4 or 5 pages, but it's a really just quick, nice primer. It's a narrative review. It's not systematic, but they did actually have some methodology. They looked through PubMed from 1977 up till they published the article for buprenorphine precipitated withdrawal. And it turns out that when we look all through PubMed for this, we don't actually know that much about it. There's only 143 full text articles, and really they were only able to include 46 articles involving human cases. And as you can see, it's a lot of case reports and people making recommendations. We really don't, we know some, but we still have a lot to learn about this. And regarding this phenomenon, it really boils down to two things. The first thing is, like almost everything in medicine, prevention is the really important key to this. And then we'll talk about treatment strategies after that. So preventing this. So standard buprenorphine dosing, right? Cows 8 to 12, we give 4. Cows greater than 13, we give 8. Second dose, 4 to 8. Total discharge plan, 12 for a day, maybe 16 after that. That's like, and that's pretty much what we do for home inductions. There's sort of two other strategies that we can do. And interestingly enough, it's either doubling down on occupying every receptor that they have with buprenorphine, or using really, really small doses over a short period of time. And these are just for references here. And mostly the important thing to remember is, if you're worried about buprenorphine precipitated withdrawal, the two strategies to avoid it while you're dosing the buprenorphine are either to go much, much bigger macro induction or much, much smaller micro induction. So the rationale for micro induction, and this is other than just the simple, like if we give little tiny amounts, right? Like in a lot of our buprenorphine trainings, we put a graph up that shows the percentage of opioid receptors that are occupied with varying doses of sublingual buprenorphine. And in general, when you get to about 8 milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine, that occupies like 70 to 80% of mu receptors, at least in volunteers in highly controlled environments. So some of the microinduction is literally just to try to not get to that number, because at 4 milligrams, you're at maybe 50% of receptors occupied, at least in volunteers. But there's more to it than that. And this is stuff that's I've only come to understand really even in the last 6 months or so. So remember earlier when we were talking about the pharmacology, I said, like all opioids, buprenorphine binds that mu receptor. And that's the partial agonist, but high affinity thing we talked about. And then I said, some opioids also activate this beta-arrestin pathway and some don't. And remember, I said buprenorphine does not activate the beta-arrestin pathway. And while we use buprenorphine for all these reasons, for the things that it does, in this case, what's really helpful is we use buprenorphine for something it doesn't do. So here's your 7-transmembrane G protein linked receptor. Here's morphine binding it. And then morphine also activates this beta-arrestin 2 regulatory protein here. So remember, all opioids bind that G protein, but some of them also bind this beta-arrestin, which you don't need to know anything beyond this. And actually, you don't even need to remember the name beta-arrestin, but what you do need to remember is that some opioids, and mostly it's full agonists, by activating this other pathway, cause the mu receptors to downregulate, so fewer at the surface, and to desensitize the ones that remain at the surface. So it's harder to get more opioid agonism from the existing opioids, which is why you continue to use more and more and more. It's not just the number of receptors at the surface of the cell, it's the ones that are still there are just not firing at the same level. Buprenorphine does not bind the beta-arrestin pathway. And actually, as you give small doses of buprenorphine, buprenorphine helps upregulate and resensitize those receptors. And this change can happen at the cellular level, even within an hour, really within minutes, of the first dose of buprenorphine. And so by giving that small dose in a microinduction, you're getting the benefit of not activating too many of them at once to have that precipitation, but also the receptors that they are binding are triggering this beta-arrestin intracellular machinery to stop, which allows you to upregulate more receptors and resensitize the receptors that are already at the surface. And that change can start to happen, again, within the first few minutes of it. And so here's that same graphic again, and you can see here's the downregulated mu receptors, right? The Pac-Men are pale on their backs. Buprenorphine comes in, but we give a low dose because it's a microinduction, and you bump off some of the existing opioids. This causes those changes because of the lack of, whoops, see, I gave away my macroinduction slide. you have more receptors being upregulated and they're activating themselves on. And so then here, a few hours later, now you can get them on, or days if you need to, maintenance buprenorphine, and you have more receptors at the surface and they're more active, which helps prevent that precipitated opioid withdrawal phenomenon. Macroinduction is much simpler, and it really is just like all the horses trying to run down Jon Snow at the Battle of the Bastards, right? Like this is just, you're just going to totally overwhelm them and say, this might hurt for a little bit, but you'll feel better in a very, very short period of time, or hopefully we'll give so much buprenorphine that you just won't have that period of discomfort. And the best data behind this, at least in emergency department patients, is the data from the California Bridge program. They have this all-encompassing comprehensive program in the Oakland, California Bay Area, out of Highland Hospital, which is the Alameda County health system. And they will dose between 24 and 36 milligrams right off the bat in the ED. And their rate of precipitated withdrawal, interestingly enough, in a 300 patient study, also about 1%. These are the advantages between the two, right? The advantages, it's slow and steady. It's good if patients have had bad experiences in the past, right? If you're starting someone on it again or trying to convince them that they should give it another try, if they say, no, that was terrible last time, we can say, nope, we can take this low and slow. Trust me, there's some reasons that this might be more successful. And if you do have the uncomfortable feeling, it won't be as bad as it was before. The downside is it requires time. It's complicated. Your patients need to be pretty high functioning, or at least come back to clinic like every day for 4 days. And you also don't get any prevention from them ODing in the short term, right? The nice thing about macroinduction, especially in the ED, is it's really, really hard for them to leave and use an OD after that, right? Whereas in a microinduction, you still have 3-4 days before you have the protection of the buprenorphine. The advantages of the macro are like as simple as watching Game of Thrones. It's real straightforward, right? It's simple, it's easy to follow, it's good for patients immediately after overdose. And if it happens, you'll know right away, and you can do other things to treat it right there. And the risk is relatively low. That paper's in JAMA Network Open, it's open access. And if you look for Andrew Herring, he's the first author, you can find it easily on the internet. I think if all things are equal, this is a paper by Mark Greenwald in Annals of Emergency Medicine that nicely illustrates the differences between macro and microdosing. The x-axis on the bottom there is this concept of opioid balance in the body that they come up with in the article. And there's pros and cons to that. But essentially, if zero is like, equilibrium with the opioids that live in your body, and the further negative you go down on the scale, the more in withdrawal you are, and the further up high you go, the more intoxicated you are. This gives you just a visual representation of the more withdrawal they have when you see them, the more likely macro is likely to be successful. And the closer they are still to intoxication, or if in the scenario, right, you're trying to transition them off methadone, a microinduction is more likely to be successful. And of course, those people in the middle are the ones we have the most challenge with. Okay, so that's prevention. The treatment part we know even less about, unfortunately, and I wish that I had like a pure, simple, clear algorithm for you, and I'll try to distill what we do know about this down. But the truth is people don't have that many cases, and we don't know all that much about this, because it turns out we can rearrange all these receptors on a chalkboard and go high, go low, go off the cows, go off the time of last induction. And then all the studies, no matter what approach you use, say, well, it happens about 1% of the time, which is not particularly helpful in terms of predicting who's going to get it or understanding the problem. But this is what we know to the best of our ability. And this is from me reading some articles, being privy to having colleagues share some challenging cases with me, and then reading the few case reports that I can find out there. So strategy number one, when you get it, is, especially if you haven't started with macroinduction, the goal is to just give additional buprenorphine, right? To go from occupying 70% of their receptors to all their receptors. And hopefully between that and the fact that you're helping them to activate the existing receptors that they have and up-regulating the receptors, that you'll be able to overcome their symptoms. And I think actually this works most of the time. And by most, I mean like a little over half, not always, but it does seem to work most of the time. You can think of this as conversion to macroinduction if you haven't already started with macroinduction. And essentially, if you're pretty sure that they had precipitated withdrawal from buprenorphine, the strategy is to give 8 to 16 milligrams at a time, in addition, up to a total of 32 milligrams. And to be real precise about that, the experts that I've been lucky enough to talk to and learn from have told me that the proper interpretation of that is 32 milligrams more than what put them into withdrawal in the first place. This is particularly important for patients who use like someone else's Suboxone or old Suboxone, or they buy it off the street and then they come and see you and they feel awful because they took it a little too close to their last use. So you have a patient who buys a tab of Suboxone, 8 milligrams, they use it, they feel awful, they come to the ED. I would dose up to 32 milligrams before you give up on buprenorphine. There's case reports up to 120 milligrams that have been used. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you use the basic science literature, but patients break rules all the time. And those studies were done under volunteers in a controlled setting, right? There's always patients that break the rules. I mean, perfect example, I had a patient with alcohol use disorder. And even though the data support you don't need more propofol for procedural sedation in alcohol use disorder patients, I had a patient who had a broken ankle with a bad alcohol use disorder who I gave 6 milligrams per kilo of IV propofol to him, and he was wide awake and still talking to me. There's always exceptional patients. And so it's reasonable to continue to go above that if you need to. The other thing is if they're vomiting and you're worried about absorption. So some of the time that the 32 isn't working, in quotes, it's because it's not actually just absorbing, because either they're vomiting or their mouth is dry and they can't get good absorption of the sublingual bupe. So remember, you can give IV buprenorphine too. Remember, sublingual bupe is only 30% bioavailable. So, and IV buprenorphine comes in 300 microgram doses. So it's like, that's kind of like the equivalent of giving 1 milligram sublingual when you give the 300 of mics IV. And I have done that less than 5 times, more than 2, and I can't remember exactly how many, but it worked okay to give titrated doses of IV buprenorphine. So that's strategy number 1 is additional buprenorphine. So here's a case example. This is a real patient we saw, a 23-year-old guy, daily IV heroin fentanyl user, comes to the ED after taking 16 milligrams of Suboxone he bought off the street. He's tachycardic, nauseated, diaphoretic, he has piloerection, hurts everywhere, doesn't use any other drugs. This cows is 33. He is miserable. We gave him 24 milligrams of sublingual Suboxone. He gets better over the next hour. His cows, I know it went down, so I'm covering up the thing. Yeah, it goes down to 12. Yeah. And then we were able to start him on 16, and then he followed up an addiction clinic after that. Oops. Remember, precipitated opioid withdrawal can be from naloxone too, and that's a great opportunity to start patients on buprenorphine when you have them. So it can, and remember, not just naloxone, but naltrexone, right, which is much like naloxone, except longer acting. And then other partial agonists too, like nalbuphine, which I've since learned is making a comeback in the EMS literature for pain. So here's an example of that. A 21-year-old man found unresponsive by EMS in a basement, he received 4 milligrams of intranasal naloxone by bystanders and then another 4 IM from EMS. His medication improves, but he's real agitated and vomiting and diaphoretic. Now his CALS was 20. He got 24 milligrams of buprenorphine and some ondansetron. His CALS went from 20 to 11. He's able to go home successfully after that and had a walk-in appointment in clinic the next day. So strategy number 2, when the buprenorphine's not working, you look at what other symptoms you have and try anything from this list of medications to try to address those symptoms. But ideally, this is done in the setting of them getting additional doses of buprenorphine. And in terms of which one to try first, it really is going to depend on what's most uncomfortable for the patient in that moment. The 2 drugs that I'll highlight that aren't on this list here are highlight droperidol, which is on the list, but I find to be the most effective of these drugs for agitation. Dexmedetomidine, which is a continuous infusion that needs to go to the ICU for. So that really is sort of a last line. And then ketamine, which this particular paper by Spadaro and colleagues is under the agitation category, but honestly, I think really ought to be under the myalgias and pain category. And I'll explain that in a little bit here. So kind of my summary for this is, in general, use more buprenorphine when it happens. I think also preparing patients for this a priori is really important too, right? If you don't tell them that the strategy is more buprenorphine if you feel bad, and then they feel bad and you say, no, don't worry, we're going to just give you more of what made you feel bad, that goes over way less well than if you tell them ahead of time. This happens 1 out of 100 times, probably won't happen to you, but if it does, the best strategy is to double down on this to make sure we just take care of all the receptors in your brain. Patients are much more interested in cooperating with that strategy if you do that. Remember, you can give IV buprenorphine if they're puking too much. And then remember that 8 milligrams of bup occupy 70% of their receptors. So you got to have those backups ready. Remember, NSAIDs and acetaminophen can be given IV or rectally. So if they're not able to swallow, that's okay. You can give those meds by routes. I think of the dopamine antagonists, the ones that are more sedating, whether you're giving them for agitation or vomiting, i.e. olanzapine and droperidol are the most effective. Longer term, if they have to be in the hospital, I think haloperidol is nicer because it lasts longer. But initially, especially in the ED, those two medicines I find to be the best. Remember to give ondansetron too, or any other antiemetics you feel like. Clonidine is fine if they can take it. Dexmedetomidine is sort of, for lack of a better explanation, it's sort of like continuous IV clonidine that tends to be more sedating as opposed to blood pressure controlling. And I have had some success with that. People have tried sedating antidepressants like trazodone. I've not had great experience with that. Remember, you can give antidiarrheals. The people in our trial who have bad cases really feel like IV dose, pain dose ketamine. So by that, I mean like 10 to 20 milligrams in an IV, like something that doesn't even require any monitoring seems to really be the trick. And as an example, I had a patient, this is a pain control issue, not a precipitated withdrawal issue, but similar problem. Patient on multiple Butrans patches for pain and also opioid use disorder, who was messing with his car when it broke down and the engine overheated and he got sprayed with hot antifreeze and burned, like second-degree burns all over his body. Came in and was in terrible pain. Opioids are doing nothing. And IV Toradol didn't do much. IV acetaminophen didn't do much. Droperidol helped a little. But the thing that really made him relax and take a deep sigh was 20 milligrams of IV ketamine. That really, really helped him. Benzos you can give, I would give them last on this list because of the co-administration issue with buprenorphine and respiratory depression. And then the last thing I would try is full dose IV opioids to try to just get them back into opioid tone. If you want an example of a worst case scenario, this is the worst case that I've been privy to, other than some cases I've heard about through the grapevine where people actually ended up intubated in the ED. I still think most of those cases, when I hear about them, there's other things that the ED clinicians could have tried. So I like this as sort of a worst case scenario case because the patient doesn't end up intubated, but does end up in the ICU. There's a woman who's a daily heroin user, last used reportedly 24 to 36 hours ago and took a total of 24 milligrams of buprenorphine at home. And by that, I mean she took 8 milligrams 3 times and felt worse after each one. Came to the ED, got some more buprenorphine for a total of 32, didn't feel better. This is an example of where I think I would have given her another 32 in the ED before trying these other things. But she got droperidol, a pretty big dose, some clonidine, a lot of Ativan, 3 big doses of ketamine for pain at least. They started her on a dexmedetomidine infusion and then titrated 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl over 90 minutes. And that altogether was enough of a cocktail to get her comfortable enough to close her eyes and rest, but not get intubated. And then she went to the ICU and then gratefully or luckily was able to do better the next morning. So questions. Oh yeah. And then I just put it in here twice. My bad. Sorry. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Olives. Unless there are questions while he's getting the slides ready.
Okay, I do have a couple questions while he's getting it up.
Yeah.
So in terms of like doing low dose inductions, and obviously there's that fear of the overdose still, but in terms of patients, the original microdose induction studies were done in not the United States, where they were literally still giving them heroin or oxy or something. And so I have patients who, will use still a whiff of fentanyl if they're, not feeling the greatest, like they're not precipitating themselves, but they're still kind of in that ick. Did you see any of that in any of these studies? Now it's hard because they're, US studies, but thoughts on that?
I've heard about it anecdotally, and certainly like I talked to Brian Grant a lot, because we communicate about follow-up between the ED and clinic. And he tells me that the patients tell him when we do home inductions that don't go great, that they do that to bridge themselves to get to clinic. But I've never seen like hard data on that. So
right.
I'm shaking in my boots because I see that Charlie's on and he has a question, which makes me think that I just said something.
I know, right?
No. I love it. I love it. This is great. I have two quick questions. One is just, maybe they're not quick. One is, you kind of alluded to this. Does anyone go from overdose Narcan straight to a high dose bup induction? Because a lot of people show up in the emergency department not ready for a traditional induction because they just overdosed or whatever. And micro induction is complicated for all the reasons you mentioned. Do you ever go from Narcan withdrawal straight into a bup induction?
I have offered that to some patients. Nobody's taken me up on it yet. I've gotten some of them to take a home induction. There are people specifically in the Camden, New Jersey area who are doing this, not just in the ED, but in the field with EMS.
Yeah.
And their preliminary data is very intriguing and reassuring, but that's a system with a very, very engaged group of EMS physicians that's doing this. When I look at the pharmacology of the drugs involved, I think that actually probably is a really good strategy for people who want to get on to buprenorphine, right? There are some people who after naloxone who have no interest at all in mood, right? But for the people who do, I actually think that's a golden opportunity, because I think in that first hour after naloxone, all I can do with buprenorphine is make you better. It might not make you all the way better, but I definitely don't think I can make you worse than naloxone. And it might be a nice way to bridge onto buprenorphine from that.
That's awesome.
And I'm assuming that's a high dose.
Most people who do that give 16 right away and then doses of 8 after that to 24 or 32.
Okay. The other one, and it's not really a question, it's just when someone mixes methadone and buprenorphine, it's just feels more, maybe subjectively, anecdotally, it feels more complicated.
Yeah.
That seems like a real mess when someone's on chronic methadone and they take a Suboxone. So I don't know if you've seen.
I have not seen that in my clinical practice. I've reviewed cases with people who have seen that. It sounds awful. They all get admitted. And then it ends up being a teeter-totter over the next 2-3 days while you're trying to get the methadone out and bridge them back on, or you just help them grin and bear it with extra medications like ketamine, dexmed, whatever, to make them feel well enough to let the buprenorphine go away if they want to get back and stay on methadone. Those are really hard.
Oh, so I can't resist. I'm sorry. I know Dr. Ellis, I want to hear you too, but how about naltrexone? When someone gets that med error and they get a naltrexone dose, we've had a.
Oh, Charlie, you have no idea how perfect this is, because that's literally what Travis is about to talk about.
It's like you planted that for me, Charlie.
Okay, cool.
John, you want to wrap up with answering that, or do you want to go ahead and move into those?
No, I want you to talk about your case, because you're going to talk about this.
Great. Does it say case for discussion for you guys? Can you just see the white screen?
It does. Can I just ask one quick question to see if in the literature? Just have you seen anybody do, I know it's not, that standard, but a Sublocade injection as that initial induction point? If we're talking really high risk patient, I'm just, we're talking a patient in a jail, because we're doing a lot of work with getting MAT in jails. And we've been doing a lot of micro inductions or we call them low dose only because I think officially the micro means you throw some opioids in there with it, but whatever. We're doing a lot of low dose inductions in the jail, which is tedious. And you know, if the percentage data is the same, then maybe I'll have to consider changing those protocols or giving options, and not that jails want to do Sublocade because it's more expensive, but like thoughts on that, like give a Sublocade shot. And
yeah,
I mean, it's almost like a high dose.
This question, I actually feel very well prepared to answer. So the short answer is I don't have a lot of experience with Sublocade because Sublocade, there's a REMS program. You have to be registered for it. It needs, like at Hennepin, we cannot give it inpatient, not just because of the cost, but because of the REMS program and the regulatory aspect from the FDA. So I don't have that. However, our trial that we're a part of is essentially a 7-day course of, it's not Sublocade, but basically it's that. So, and that we have definitely enrolled people immediately in that after naloxone period. And that I think works really, really well. One, because then they're protected for a week right off the bat. And two, there's no worry about, are they absorbing the sublingual buprenorphine at all? Right? It's a sub-Q shot. It goes right in the belly. It's about the same amount of pain as an insulin shot, and they're done. You can supplement with additional sublingual buprenorphine if that's not enough, but there's enough absorption early on from the sub-Q shot that they feel better within the first hour, and they're now protected for the next week and they can bridge. And I like that, especially for those ultra acute patients, better than Sublocade, because one, assuming that drug gets approved in the next year, which I think it will, there's a PDUFA date in May for it. So I think actually it's likely to come to the market later this year. I don't know what the cost will be, but you give it in the outpatient setting, it should be reimbursable on a line item basis. And in the ED, it'll just be part of the ED bill. But it protects people for a week, but it also doesn't commit them to it for a month if they just are not ready to be on Suboxone either. And it gives them a week to follow up in clinic.
So typically the bridge would then be to a sublingual product or to a Sublocade.
Or to Sublocade once they get to clinic, right? Or honestly, even to methadone. I mean, like the point is just to bridge them to something and have them protected for that week while they're waiting to get in.
Perfect. So that is a new Sublocade or new buprenorphine and a subcutaneous product. Yep,
it's the investigational name is called CAM 2038. It's only you can only get it right now if you enroll in one of the trials for it. There's an inpatient version too that Gavin Bart is doing on the inpatient side here too. But I think sometime in the next year it will be something that's available to use regularly, and that we're glad to come back and do an echo if and when that happens. So
yes, that would be amazing.
I'm going to turn it over to Travis.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you, Travis. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, John. My name is Travis Olive. For those who don't know me, I'm the Associate Medical Director at the Poison Center here, working with John. And I'm also one of our emergency physicians here at HCMC. I'm also the program director for our combined residency in emergency medicine, internal medicine, and the EM/IM critical care residency. And like John, I've got a couple of irons in the fire for public health surveillance and research here that are somewhat related. One of which is called Mendoza, which some of you, I know at least one of you is familiar with, the Minnesota Drug Overdose and Substance Use Surveillance Activity, which is through the Department of Health looking at novel drugs of abuse in the population. And the other is actually an FDA-funded study that's called DOTS, or the Drug Overdose Toxicosurveillance Reporting Program, which is through the American College of Medical Toxicology. So a couple of different things that I like spending my time doing. This is a case that came to us through one of our MedTox fellows here at the Poison Center, Ryan Fuchs, who's a great guy and had helped a little bit with this case when one of our EM grads contacted him about it. From outstate, I, in truth, don't know the city that this started in, nor do I want to, because I want to maintain the confidentiality of it. But this is a woman in her mid-30s who's a healthy person, and her only real past medical includes a history of a degree of ethanol abuse, and then some significant kratom abuse with dependence. Kratom. I say kratom. I don't truly know the right pronunciation of it. Apparently, John says kratom. I'll always think I'm right, but he probably is. That's how it usually works. She's not on any known medications and denies that she's actually on any now. And the long and the short of it is that she's got this long-standing history of kratom abuse. It's daily. We don't know the dose that she's typically taking, and I'll talk about kratom in a second. And I'm hopeful that there are at least some of you who don't know what kratom is, but maybe every single person on this call knows what kratom is, and this is the cat will be out of the bag pretty quick. This patient had made the decision and come to the time when it was for her to taper. She wanted to finish up with kratom and not be using it anymore. And made the plan and initiated a taper and even discussed it with her primary care provider, acknowledged that she was using, indicated that she wanted to get off, and made the plan that she would start to taper with a little bit of help from her PCP. And that the plan was that somewhere down the line, they would likely initiate some maintenance therapy after a period of a taper to a point that she was no longer using. She started that taper. It was self-driven. She initiated it very slowly. And at a subsequent office visit, the decision was made to initiate therapy to minimize craving. And at that point in time, what she told her primary care provider was that she had discontinued that kratom use for a period of time. It wasn't clear how long it had been, but regardless, reported that she was no longer using. And to the point that Charlie so appropriately made earlier, she was initiated on oral naltrexone. So naltrexone, you guys know very well, is quite long acting, and I won't belabor that too much, but I am going to belabor a little bit what kratom is, because I find this to be an absolutely fascinating drug. This is not currently scheduled in the U.S. to my knowledge, even though there are some laws that govern its importation as an adulterant. But it's a tree-like shrub that's native to Southeast Asia. It's thought in the U.S. that there's anywhere between 3 and 5 million regular users of kratom. And when you look at our Poison Center data, in the 6 years that are reported there, we'd had about 1,800 kratom reports across the country of kratom users, which of course, since we're only as good as the data that's reported to us, is almost certainly a woeful underrepresentation of the complications that have come of its use. Kratom often will be ground up, made into capsules, used as a tea, and dosed multiple times per day. But what's really interesting about it is it's actually a mu and delta and kappa opioid receptor drug. It's an agonist at all three of those, and it has some other activity too. And what I find fascinating about it is that anywhere from about 2 to 6 grams per dose, which is what's reported to be taken, there are some stimulant effects related to the complicated activity that it has. Above 7 grams or so, you end up getting the sedating and more opioid-like effect. But there's a lot of alkaloids, like most of our plant-derived substances of abuse, 25 or so, that are responsible for the mixed effects of kratom. The main one is called mitragynine, and then 7-hydroxymitragynine. Mitragynine is thought to be about 13-fold more potent than morphine, and 7-hydroxy is about 4 times more potent than that, but the doses that are present in it are quite small. Lots of other mechanisms that we won't go over, but the effects are the opioid effects that you might expect, but then there's tachycardia, agitation, and seizures, typically at those lower doses, although certainly in overdose you can see it as well. And to put up something very similar to what John had put up earlier, and I didn't actually know he was going to put that up in his talk, just looking at the affinity for receptors of mitragynine, you can see it is, in fact, it has an affinity both the mu, kappa, and delta opioid receptors, in addition to the other ones that I mentioned. And this is actually it's a really cool case report that Kavita Babu, and Ed Boyer put out just a little bit ago. And what was really kind of interesting about this paper, and I would encourage you guys to take a look at it because it's just really kind of cool. This is one person in Massachusetts who had a seizure while co-administering kratom with modafinil. And what they said is that one striking finding of this report is the extent to which kratom attenuates potentially severe opioid withdrawal, yet cessation of kratom administration itself appears to be associated with only modest abstinence symptoms. And clinically, we certainly see this, and I suspect that some of you have too, that folks that are trying to detox from opioids will occasionally turn to kratom. And that's something that we hear not uncommonly. I certainly have myself, and I know John and I have spoken about cases he's seen. But certainly the several convergent effects that it has could attenuate the opioid withdrawal symptoms and blunt those cravings. So this patient receives naltrexone. And after receiving it, she presented to a smaller outstate emergency department with pretty severe agitation. And at the time that she presented there, she received 40 milligrams of diazepam, 10 milligrams of olanzapine, a phenobarb small load plus another smaller load, and 58 milligrams of lorazepam. So to the point John made earlier, I believe, John, the case that you reported was 9 milligrams of lorazepam, which is still a hefty dose. This person received 58 milligrams of lorazepam for her severe agitation related to the exposure to naloxone. In complete honesty, there was some concern that maybe this was potentially related to ethanol withdrawal based on how agitated she was. But there was very clearly a strong history of acutely precipitated symptoms immediately following her first dose of naltrexone. So I'll open this up just for a second to see what folks think about this and any comments they might have on the case or questions about it. Anybody that would have given buprenorphine for this case?
This would have been a phone call I would have made to either Charlie or Beth Bilden. So I don't really have any comments, but I felt like I should at least make one of them say something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm not super confident in all the different ways that kratom or kratom withdrawal presents. Like, it's not like I don't like have great clinical reflexes on it, but I do think if the COWS score, which you might not fully trust if this is multifactorial withdrawal, there's alcohol, sedative withdrawal and alcohol. But if the COWS score is sufficient, I mean, based on what John said and what I've heard that elsewhere, if you have a COWS more than 8, or certainly a COWS more than 10, you can give it a try. I mean, it's probably won't hurt them. On the other hand, if you guess wrong and you're mixing high dose benzos with a buprenorphine that they don't need, I would want to have oximetry going, I guess. But besides that, and maybe that's self-explanatory, but besides that, I think they're in so much distress. If they have a high COWS score, you might as well go for it.
Beth is calling Cole. We're all calling the friend in this situation. So Travis, what happened?
Yeah, I think what's really remarkable in this case is, to my knowledge, she actually was not intubated at this point. And Charlie, to your point, from my standpoint, and I think that there's room for argument on this, I think that this is a pretty darn good college try at controlling symptoms. And so, presumably the next step, Charlie, after which you're worried about is whether or not this patient will need to be intubated. And I think that's a very real concern here, right? And that's a plausible outcome here. I can comfortably make the argument that after 58 milligrams of lorazepam, I'm quite surprised they're not intubated already. And that may need to be a component of the management of this point. And so buprenorphine is probably not losing you a whole lot, regardless of which direction that goes in. But that's my own opinion personally. This is hard because clearly this goes back to that important point that all of us have a hard time with occasionally, because some of our patients have reasons not to divulge everything, obviously for a number of different reasons, but it's how to address this patient's history, since clearly the story of not utilizing either this weak mu agonist or something else was probably not the whole truth. And the likelihood is that the kratom use had continued. To my knowledge, buprenorphine was not considered initially on this. And that, I think, largely was because the providers to whom she presented were not particularly familiar with kratom as a drug and did not recognize it as an acute syndrome of opioid withdrawal. But I think at that time of presentation, when the precipitated withdrawal was so evident, and really, I think this is in line with some of the things that John was mentioning earlier, going with a macro dose strategy at that point to try and alleviate this withdrawal syndrome would be a very reasonable thing to consider. And certainly, I think hindsight's 2020. But in this case, it's hard to imagine getting a whole lot worse than requiring olanzapine, phenobarbital, lorazepam, and so on and so forth, or potentially full agonist therapy, depending on what your preference is. Beth, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this case at all, since you got called out there as well.
I think just what has already been said, I think before adding a second benzo on top of the diazepam, that seems like a good time to consider it. The other thing I think that you mentioned is because patients end up intubated, it doesn't mean a failure of treatment. And I think by giving more to the point of maybe they're going to need intubation, but right now we're still trying to prevent the intubation. That's why we're doing what we're doing, to give them a chance. So I think that management that, okay, well, at some point, yes, they may need intubation, but hopefully not.
And I think that's important, Beth, because by the time that I'm getting to that 59th milligram of lorazepam, I'm pretty much thinking that's the direction that I'm going in. And for my part, I probably would have been doing that earlier, but I'd like to think that early on, like you said, and maybe after the diazepam, maybe somewhere early on, that I would have considered buprenorphine for this to try and ameliorate it. John, do you have any comments at all?
Nothing other than kind of what I covered at the end of my lecture, and that there's a couple other things that I would want to try. I based on the pharmacology of kratom, I would have, the description we got from the doc we know there was that this really looked clinically like opioid withdrawal, and that the agitation was really more from the just abject misery that the patient was in, as opposed to like true delirium. And so I would have liked to have tried buprenorphine before getting too far down the benzo road. And, this took place in an ED, so monitoring is okay to do. And my experience with ketamine has been reasonably positive. It's been, only a handful of cases, but nationally the feedback I get is really positive on that. And then I probably would have given more on the dopamine antagonist, droperidol kind of aspect of things too, but she ultimately sort of did okay in the end. They're really hard cases. And I think your point earlier is really worth reinforcing, Travis, of people aren't always forthcoming with supplements in the way they are with medications, or even with the street drugs that they use. Either because they don't want to talk about them because they're stigma, or they think that they're just not important. And this is one that it isn't just buprenorphine that you can get in trouble with. Any opioid antagonist or partial agonist could precipitate withdrawal in someone who uses a lot of kratom.
Thanks, John. Well, I'll put this up. This is the last slide in this deck for right now, and then we can just have some discussion. But John, these are yours. We've discussed these ad nauseum, I think, but the precipitated opioid withdrawal is certainly rare, but incredibly important to plan for. To the point of how to address the patient's history, I put that on myself too, and make sure that all of my patients know that the risk of feeling absolutely miserable is real, even if it's very small, and at least let them make an informed decision in the ED about whether or not to receive buprenorphine. And I think that in general, that gets taken really well to have that conversation. And then the treatment, of course, for it is more of the buprenorphine. To John's point, there are a number of different adjuncts that are out there if even high dose buprenorphine were to fail, including the list that's in the slide deck that I suspect that Heather will have access to afterwards. Is that right? Yeah. Good. And then that precipitated withdrawal, and really just the withdrawal syndrome in general after discontinuing kratom is real. I'm not sure how many of you have seen that come through your clinical sites, but certainly I've managed several of them, both that have developed pretty significant withdrawal after discontinuing use. And then, of course, this case shows the nth degree of that. All right. Any other thoughts or comments on the kratom?
For Samantha's question there in the chat, so a patient who takes opioids prescribed for pain and also kratom, put on Suboxone to try to get him off opioids and went through terrible withdrawal. Would you have added more Suboxone, or think of this more as buprenorphine precipitated withdrawal? And I guess my answer to that question is sort of yes, globally. So I think I probably would have increased the Suboxone and tried to encourage them to taper the kratom as soon as possible. and transition over to Suboxone with the hope that that would cover the things that the patient was taking the kratom for. But that's a challenging question.
I do have a question on back to the precipitated withdrawal, the patient, the take home thing, John, back to your part. Again, I typically do low dose, make a lot of phone calls back and forth with patients. Patients, again, are afraid of having that precipitated withdrawal if they have done it to themselves in the past, as you alluded to. And then you had mentioned that if that starts to happen, then they should be empowered to take more, like turn themselves into a macro induction. Yep. How do you educate the patient on what constitutes, yes, you should take more, or actually, no, this is kind of the normal evolution and take your Zofran instead, or, your adjunctive medications?
Ooh, that's tough. I think the time course is helpful. And then, I also try to tell them, like with 10, 15 minutes, by the way, kratom does not typically show up on a urine drug screen.
No, you got to order a mitragynine, speciosa, send out, and it takes forever.
Right. It takes forever. Yeah. I think the time course, if you feel substantially worse within 10 to 15 minutes, that might be the buprenorphine. If it's longer than that, it's probably not. And I try to make sure patients are really in that opioid imbalance towards withdrawal before they start. So Brian's words for when he talks to them in clinic are, I don't want you to just feel shitty. I want you to feel really shitty. And I think that's a reasonable way to go about it. I try to tell them, I don't have the luxury of having much of a relationship with our patients, right? Because we meet them for such a short period. And so I tend to be a little bit more concrete with them and just say, I don't want you to start this when you feel bad. I want you to start this when you actually start to have diarrhea and vomiting, like objective things that are like, that there's leave no room for interpretation. Because all you have to do working any kind of acute care is to see that the world is full of people who experience subjective symptoms so dramatically differently that it's really hard to say, I feel bad or I have pain or that kind of thing. So that's how I go about it.
Yeah. I think the timing thing is huge as well.
I think so.
That's my
the longer you can wait, the better. I don't know what truth in the universe is on that, because that in the 9 cases in the trial, timing had literally nothing to do with any of them. Like it wasn't like, so you know what I mean? So like I have this cognitive dissonance between my experience, which tells me the time matters, and the data, which are suggesting that maybe it doesn't. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, that it's rare enough that it's hard to make hard and fast rules. But in general, it's better to get them to wait longer if you can.
Perfect. Well, this was an amazing. Sorry.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I just said
no.
To my next.
Yeah, no, you guys gotta work too. This was a fabulous talk. I think a lot of people are going to be looking through it again or watching the slides and everything. This was so great. Definitely when you have, the studies are coming out or more information, we will welcome you back with open arms. So thank you both. And we'll see everybody else next week.